So let's start with a quick question. How many of you have heard of the word dystopia? Yeah, pretty much everyone. But let's just start off with a basic definition, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Dystopias are pretty much a projection of what society fears the most. And as you might expect, that would kind of change depending on the time frame that you're looking at. Yeah, there we go. So in the aftermath of the two world wars, it was pretty much the totalitarian state that everyone was afraid of. In the Cold War, it was nuclear Armageddon. In the 90s, it was corporate ownership and control. These days, it's probably edging more towards environmental disaster. But let's also ask another question. Dystopias aren't so much a question, is it? It's not so much speculation of what if it happened here. It's mostly a warning that it could always happen here. And so let's just ask a different question now that everyone seems to know what dystopia is. How many of you think that you've experienced dystopia? Okay, so if you haven't raised your hands, you're probably a lot more optimistic than I am. But also, you might just be thinking of those really surrealist, heightened dystopias, the 100, the Hunger Games, those the YA novels that have flooded our mass media these last few decades, right? And the thing is, well, those are real, those are surrealist, and we don't really believe in them. But at the same time, we've all kind of experienced dystopia at some level. And the thing is, well, if you do think you've been part of a dystopia, you're kind of part of a cultural movement towards what I would call radical pessimism. And that's a sentiment that Nick Bryant kind of captures pretty well in his article, A Letter to Our Newborn American Daughter, in which he writes of the many overwhelming, seemingly unfixable social problems that have flooded our mass media these last few decades. And if you look at all of these, well, we've all experienced them to some extent, haven't we? So now that we've had this basic definition, because I'm a student in both law and literature, I'm kind of obligated to, as much as give you an idea of what a vision of dystopia looks like, I'm also obligated to tell you how this kind of radical pessimism, this sentiment, gets translated into a legal structure. So let's take a look at the legal order of a dystopia, how this works. First of all, we have religion, which is either completely banned because the ruling party is God, or it is severely restricted because it is supposed to be a justification, a front for tyranny. That's the case of The Handmaid's Tale. And if you've read that book, you'll know that it's a social hierarchy derived of the male commanders, the domestic wives, and their sexual surrogates, the handmaids. Now that social structure is derived from the biblical story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. So basically, if you disagree with the theocracy, it wouldn't just be illegal, it would be heresy. Next, we have sexual pleasure, which again is severely restricted, and that's because the state is very much aware that any private emotional attachments that aren't to itself are a threat. Again, in The Handmaid's Tale, the handmaids are not supposed to have any kind of illicit sexual passion with anyone other than their male commanders, and even passion is kind of a stretch. They are state-sanctioned rape, basically, every month. It's called a ceremony for a reason. So basically, sexual pleasure is restricted in order for everyone to appropriate their energies towards serving the state. Finally, we have language. Language is basically restricted to a very rigid and mechanical vocabulary because, again, the state needs to make sure that all dissident ideas are literally unthinkable. That's the entire philosophy of the Newspeak Project in Orwell's 1984. But if you look at these three elements, there might be something occurring to you, and it's that dystopias are really kind of dystopias are composed of these elements because they're motivated by an extreme impulse to order. But that's a disturbing thing because it is something that it shares with its flip side, the utopia. Now, I don't think I need to tell you what a utopia is because I guarantee you that you've been there in the middle of your daydreams, in the middle of your 9-to-5s, in the middle of a lecture, preparing for exams. You have to daydream to yourself out of that kind of monotony, right? But at the same time, we know that they're not real. We have to snap out of them. And that's also something that legal and political scholars have had their finger on in these last few centuries, basically. Thomas More, back in 1516, when he coined the term utopia, well, it literally means no place. And more recently, Laporte tells us that dystopias follow utopias like thunder follows lightning. There is an impression that utopias create their own dystopias. Now, why is that? So Margaret Atwood gives us something of a summary. She says that when we try to enforce utopia, they inevitably become dystopias, because if someone disagrees with us, we have to manipulate or control or terrorize them. And then we have 1984. Now, Robert Paul Wolff tries to imagine how a utopia would look like. Basically, he tries to imagine an anarchy, a lawless egalitarian society in which everyone agrees. But this would only really happen if the individuals in that society are only faced with laws and rules that they have consented to, that they have agreed with. Now, let's try to take a look at how this would work out in real life. And again, we have to turn to literature, to fiction. So let's take a look at The Dispossessed. It's aptly subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia. And why exactly is it subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia? Well, mostly because the utopia that it describes isn't really that utopian. It's not perfect. There is no idea of what possession or privacy means. The authoritarian state may be gone, but it's replaced by the dictatorship of public opinion. And if you go against public opinion, you're honestly told to go away by yourself for a while to a place called the asylums. We have prisons. This utopia has asylums. Punishment as a legal deterrent exists even in a lawless society. Conformity to a collective will in a utopia is just as complete as the loss of individuality is in a dystopia. So why even consider this place a utopia? Well, mostly because the individuals in it, they know that their world isn't perfect. They understand the importance of sharing in hardship. They understand that they need to progress, to change. And they realize that utopias aren't so much something to be created once and for all, but something constantly recreated. But let's let that sink in for a bit. That sounds kind of exhausting, doesn't it? Utopias, well, we look at that whole barrage of problems that I showed you in the beginning, and we don't want to take care of them. We just want a magic wand to make it all go away, right? But that would also be sinking into that trap of the traditional utopia. And that's a world of stasis and stagnation, because if everything's already perfect, why do we need to go anywhere? That's why the utopia is called no place. It goes nowhere. So what do we do instead? We let dystopias proliferate. We indulge in radical pessimism. That's why our media has been flooded with dystopias these last few decades. That's why Margaret Atwood tells us utopias we can only imagine, dystopias we've already had. But I would argue that this is a false dichotomy, because dystopias and utopias aren't so much binary opposites. They are codependent, they're symbiotic. They rely on each other because they give each other the reason to go on changing. This is something that Lyman Towers Sargent calls social dreaming, a general vocation common to both of these models. It's a general desire to make the world a better place. But how does this work out in reality? Let's take a look at what legal scholars tell us. There we go. So Michael Walzer says that what we need are basic rights and deliberative legal processes to remain in place, because these prevent against utopian excess. Jacobi wants utopian thinkers and leaders who will strive for utopia without abandoning the possibilities for its redemption. Most importantly, van der Waals, who distinguishes between radical and legal utopianism. Radical utopianism is the pathway that the literature steers us towards, the cataclysmic decline, the kind of abstract dream that would tear at the very fabric of reality and eventually just turn into dystopia because we can't agree what perfect means. But there's also legal utopianism, what the law steers us towards, that very prudent and careful, pragmatic departure from reality, because it acknowledges that we can only really take care of the human suffering that already exists. Law cannot be the genesis of societies. It can only be a reaction to pre-existing legal norms and socio-political issues. So let's try and wrap this up by going back to what Bryant tells us. If our current normal isn't working, and it isn't, we need to create a new one. Utopias have to be constantly recreated because dystopias are always looming on the horizon. So don't take your freedoms and your rights for granted. Let us not be complacent. The fight for them is never over. Thank you.